Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. It's really a great honor to welcome Dr. Nathan Hatch today as our guest on Conversing. Nathan Hatch has spent his entire career in higher education, first as a professor and scholar, intriguing the minds of young thinkers as a historian. Next, as an administrator, learning and cherishing the value of teamwork, and finally, as president, providing steadfast vision to strengthening the community. He has been at Wake for the last 16 years of his career, and recently retired there as its 13th president. He wove together a deep sense of tradition and high innovation. He attracted new talent. He defined the vision of a collegiate university. He broadened the university's appeal and built very strong leadership teams. And that's really the subject of the profiles that he provides in his most recent book that we're going to discuss, called The Gift of Transformative Leaders. What a great joy it is, Nathan, to have you today on Conversing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, Mark.
You know, Nathan, your life has been one that's had more impact on me than you might know. I think the first time I encountered you was through your writing, and I continue to particularly cite various books that have had a huge imprint on my understanding of America as a historian, and my understanding of the church in America as a historian, and my understanding of how culture and church and the academy actually all converge. It was then during the years that I was president at Fuller that we had more opportunity to get acquainted. And I felt extremely grateful for the privilege of having you on the board and the wisdom that you were able to bring to that. So I'm excited today to get to jump into your latest book. But before we do that, just give people who may not be as well acquainted with you a bit of your personal history and the leadership roles that you've had at Notre Dame and also at Wake are profoundly important jobs and work that you've done with excellence in every possible way. But I'm interested in how you got there and how your spiritual life affected your leadership and vice versa.
Great. My father was a Presbyterian minister and a teacher, and I was raised in a wonderful Christian home. And so the faith to me was always a positive thing. And I went to Wheaton College, and I grew up in South Carolina. I sort of wanted to see a different part of the world, and being around Chicago was great. In the summer, I worked in Chicago. Actually, one summer I lived in a Black church in the Cabrini Green situation. So all of that was very eye-opening. But my father was both a minister and had studied psychology. He could never understand why I was interested in history.
Yes.
But I was.
Yes.
I had a great history teacher in the 7th and 8th grade. And so I always thought I wanted to study history and probably teach history. And so that sort of was what I did. I earned a doctorate at Washington University in St. Louis, did a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. And oddly enough, in some ways, for a Southern evangelical Protestant, got a job teaching early American history at Notre Dame.
Wow. That is an unlikely step.
And so I studied sort of relationship of religion and politics. And Notre Dame was a great place. It had a wonderful history department. They'd had a doctoral program since the 1940s. I had wonderful colleagues. And my goal is to be a great historian and to write and to teach. And that's what I did for about a decade. And then sort of in a surprising move, a new dean of the liberal arts there called me up and said, would I be interested in coming to work as an associate dean? So I did that, and then for many years sort of balanced teaching, research, administration, but eventually moved more to administration, became dean of the graduate school, and then provost.
Right.
But in some ways, how my professional life and faith, one of the main ways it was enriched was that I was fortunate to work in great teams. When I was recruited in my first job, there were 3 of us new in the job. We were in each other's offices every day. It was just a wonderful team effort. It was sort of life-giving.
Yes, yes.
And so as I moved more into administration, that sort of was in the back of my mind, that
Right.
Organizations are best served when you have a team of like-minded people,
Yes.
each using their own strengths. And that comported, I think, with my faith. I was also fortunate to be part of a group of young Christian historians who we were once young. People like George Marsden and Mark Knoll and Harry Stout and George Rawlick
Yes.
and Joel
Yes.
Carpenter. And we all sort of emerged in similar times, and we
Yes.
did grants together for about 8 years. We and our families would meet every summer, often
Wow.
on Cape Cod, and we would read papers to each other. We were deep friends. We'd play softball together. It just was wonderful to have to live in community of like-minded people of faith.
Yes, yes. I'm sure that's hugely formative. So if we go back to the history teacher that was so influential, just tell us about that, because that's a significant light bulb, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, Mrs. Daniel, 7th and 8th grade history teacher at a place called University High School. It was a lab school on the campus of the University of South Carolina. Whatever it was, she just, one year it was American history, the next year world history. She just made it come alive. And I was sort of also interested in politics. I loved to go to Washington and go to the House and the Senate.
Yes.
But I just was captivated by studying history. And so that's what I majored in at Wheaton, and sort of never, when I finished Wheaton, I remember taking the law exam. I said, if history doesn't work out, that would be something logical, but I just kept studying.
Right. What was it about history, though? I mean, there's lots of different ways that people could be motivated by history, but as you know, it's notoriously a subject that some people don't find interesting. So what was it that grabbed you?
Well, when I taught introductory history, I would say most of you probably have had bad history, and that's memorizing names, dates, and places.
Yes.
And that'd be like studying literature by sort of memorizing Shakespeare's the names of his plays.
Right.
And what I found interesting is, in some ways, the sort of dynamic. The past is really different.
Yes.
And how did it come to change? And how did it come to create the world in which we live?
Yes.
And so it was those sort of human dynamics, the role of individuals, the role of cultures, and sort of what were the dynamics of change?
Right.
How is it that people at one point could believe in the divine right of kings, and we just as much by faith believe in democracy? I mean, both are sort of fictions.
Yes.
But how did one change into the other? And obviously, if you're going to understand issues of race in America, you have to come to grips with history and how slavery came to be and what were its dynamics.
Yes. One of the things that strikes me about that is that in this book that we're going to be talking about, The Gift of Transformative Leaders, you focus on 13 leaders, and we'll discuss a bit about them in a moment. But one of the things that struck me, knowing you as the writer of this, is that it does portray a certain kind of vision of how a leader affects change and what is that causes that change to unfold. So I couldn't help but wonder then how your ability to even write this book and to lead in the way that you have was in a certain way made by being a historian? How did being a historian, in other words, set you up to be able to be the kind of observer of leaders that this book beautifully exemplifies?
I do think actually living in different times and places, or living empathetically,
Yes.
helps you to understand differing people, that there's not one way to understand something. I think it gives a kind of empathy.
Yes.
And I don't know how formative that was, but I do think, and actually just being in a university, I mean, I was a historian. My first jobs were then in the liberal arts, became dean of the graduate school.
Yes.
I had to, I visited science labs to understand how that's different. I visited lawyers, I visited engineers, and
Right.
to really understand these are very different worlds,
Mm-hmm.
and how we're one university, but as it were, speaking many different languages.
Right. Right. It is
I
a
think
universe.
being a historian helped comprehend that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, certainly it's the case that in this book, which features 13 leaders, some from your years at Notre Dame and some from your years at Wake, these 13 leaders that you choose are people who are themselves exemplars, and you are an exemplar even as you're telling their stories. It's such a reflection of who you are, and how you do it is a story of how Nathan Hatch is himself a transformative leader. We'll come to that a little bit later. But before we get to that, let me just ask one other question about the process of your development. So when along the way would you say you saw a leader, historical or contemporary, that suddenly maybe put a whole lot of pieces together? And if you can say, who was that and why did they capture your imagination?
Yeah. I mean, various people. I mean, I was very influenced as a young faculty member. The president of Notre Dame was Father Theodore Hesburgh.
Right.
A commanding leader, someone who always had a great vision.
Yes.
His vision that somehow this Catholic school in the Midwest was going to be a great Catholic university.
Yes.
And no matter, there were many things about when he took over in 52, it was anything but. It was a great football team.
Right. It had its priorities straight.
But he believed that, and he sort of unflinchingly kept that vision. And that was remarkable to see. And he was, first of all, a priest. I mean, in that sense, for instance, I can remember when my wife, Julie, was pregnant. He met her on campus. He stopped and said, "Can I bless your child?" And that's just who Hesburgh was.
Right.
And he was unfailingly gracious.
Yes.
And just was a model. I mean, that's one thing. I also was aware of, when I saw good departments or programs at Notre Dame, those who became really good always had a great leader. Organizations aren't self-generating.
Right. Right.
And like the philosophy department at Notre Dame became sort of world class.
Yes.
And it was because starting in the 1960s, an Irish priest named Arlen Mullen sort of said, Notre Dame we have to be good. We have to do analytic philosophy. And he started hiring really talented young Catholic and later Protestant philosophers. But it was out of a vision and a leader.
Right.
It just didn't spring up naturally, as it were.
Right. Right.
And I guess I was an observer. Colleges or programs that were well-led prospered. Those who weren't stayed the same or went backwards.
Yes. Yes.
And so that sort of lodged in my mind.
Yes. I think going back to Hesburgh for a minute, one of the things that I remember in watching his memorial service, which I did, and actually rewatching it, I watched it twice, partly because I just wanted to keep hearing the way that his life was being interpreted and the manifestation that his life actually was, including the detail that because of the order that he was in, he was just buried as an ordinary priest with a regular grave, without any exceptionalism to it whatsoever, deliberately and purposefully, just an offering. And I do think that one of the things that stands out about several of the people that you focus on is that quality of having a gifts, but then living generously, graciously, capaciously to simply make the offering that you can make. And
Right.
and that was certainly true of him, and is also true of many of the people that you've described in the book in a quite wonderful way. It's also one of your great qualities. So tell me, when you were making the choice between staying in the classroom and making initially just a kind of, it sounds like maybe a testing move to be an associate dean and see what this whole administrative universe of higher education might be about, what was it that snapped into place for you that made it seem like, oh no, this is actually what I want to hold. I want to hold on to administrative leadership and scholarship, because you've continued to write all during your years as president or provost.
I love teaching. I love writing. But I was part of this team in the college, and
Yes.
the college needed to change. It tended to be very traditional. And I think we were able to say, what do we do to support our faculty and make this place great?
Yes.
And actually I had a very interesting assignment. When I asked the dean, when he asked me to come work, I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, I don't know. He said, we do our student advising, we do our finance, we do this. He said, I want you to figure out what we need to be doing that we are not doing.
Wow.
And what a wonderful assignment.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh.
And so I worked closely with development. We raised a lot of money for faculty development. How do we support our faculty?
Yes. Yes.
And that was most rewarding, to basically say the standards at Notre Dame were rising. How do we help faculty flourish? And that was for 3 or 4 years. That's what I did.
Yes. Yes.
And that was just so rewarding to see how an organization can change.
Right.
It seems like noticing people. I remember we would start a reception at the end of the year and put out a newsletter of what were the accomplishments for the year. We had an office where people could come brainstorm about what kind of conference do you want to hold? What's the next step for a middle-aged person?
Yes.
What's the next step in your research? What can make you intellectually vital? And so I began to see, in that sense, I'm not a good administrator. I'm not particularly organized, but probably my gifts are more in sort of vision, building teams.
Yes.
So it was more, how do you make an organization better and life-giving for everyone in it? Right. And I got enough taste of that when I was asked to do the next job, I agreed to do it.
Right. So it was really, it sounds in part that it was a vision of cultivation and the power of cultivation, that you could take what was there, enhance it with new people where needed or possible, but also how do you cultivate who you have, and how do you want them to exceed what they might be currently doing and to really flourish? Right.
In some ways, I think it's an outworking of a Christian vision of the importance of everyone. And so how does an institution, as it makes demands on people, how does it support them? How does it, in this case, an academic community that's not just in name only?
Yes.
But allows people to prosper.
Right.
Because it was at a time when Notre Dame was setting higher standards.
Yes.
It was moving towards being a research university. So the requirements for faculty were very stringent.
Yes, right. So Nathan, you are in this job which ultimately leads you to becoming the provost at Notre Dame for a substantial period of time. And then you go on and become president at Wake Forest University. So the book that we're going to now turn to is a book where you take these 13 stories, 13 people, and you focus on their particular giftedness and how it was discerned and discovered, in part, how they were seen by you and or referred to by others who saw them acutely, and then how the cultivation process of their own life and their potential relationship to the university that you might be trying to woo them to, because most of these, I think, are people that you hired. So it's not just any group. It's a group of people that you hired who had these very, very, very strong capacities. And so let's talk about them before we then talk about you. So choose one or two of the stories to just give listeners a sensibility about the people and what it was that you saw in them. Let me just suggest a couple. Like one of the people that you and I have spoken about at some length is the hiring of Andy Chan. Tell us about Andy, what you saw, how that stood out, why it seemed right, and how it matched.
Yeah. Well, Andy is someone who was Stanford trained. He was on the swimming team at Stanford. He had an MBA from Stanford. He had worked in big corporations. He had worked for Bain as a consultant, and then had come back to Stanford to head career services for the business school. And that's what he said. He really found his vocation and is helping others navigate, what am I going to do with my life?
Yes.
And he actually taught a course at Stanford called Career and Life Vision, where he really would ask almost religious or certainly philosophical questions about what are your goals in life and how should your profession map against that. And so we had a pretty pedestrian career service office at Wake Forest, and it was time for a change. I had been deeply interested in bigger questions of vocation, partly through involvement with the Lilly Endowment and their deep interest in that. And I always just thought it was critical for young people to think seriously about what they were going to do with their lives.
Yes.
Andy was introduced to me by Steve Reineman, who had come here as Dean of Business, who had been CEO of PepsiCo. And so I was on the West Coast, visited with Andy, invited him to come to Wake as a consultant to look at our career services.
The lure, yes.
So he spent a few days here, and one thing led to another, and we sort of envisioned a completely remaking career services. I mean, we hired Andy as a vice president for personal and career development, made him part of the president's cabinet.
Right.
And sort of, it was at a time, it was 2008, 2009. It was we didn't really have new money. And we just said, we're going to try it. And he was parents were so interested in this.
Yes.
That he got a major ongoing funding from parents.
Wow.
And so started a whole program, greatly expanded, and sort of became a sort of model for starting from the time students enter college. How do they think about career? Not what they're going to major in. And the wonderful thing at a liberal arts institution like Wake was, major in anthropology, major in music, but then with your left hand, you can also think about, I'd also like being at Wall Street, or I'd like to work in advertising. And then charting those paths directly.
Right.
Andy he's just been a terrific partner over the years. He's a deep person of faith. He's a great leader. But I could not have hired Andy into a conventional position.
Right. I
guess I love the statement made by Executive Larry Bossidy. At the end of the day, you bet on people, not on strategy.
Yes.
And then that would have never, it was Andy's vision and implementation that made that happen. It wasn't an idea of let's do something.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it was an idea, but it had to be instantiated in a person.
Yes, exactly. So let's do two more. Tell us about Jill Tiefenthaler, who must now have one of the greatest jobs in the whole universe, which is to be the CEO of National Geographic. But in the process, she was a transformative leader as well. So tell us about her and her story.
Well, she grew up on the farm in Iowa. She actually went to St. Mary's College next door to Notre Dame and went to Duke. We got a PhD in economics. She met her husband. They were both in economics of higher education. She taught at Colgate and was kind of a star. She's just a very dynamic person. And she was attracted to administration, but they had just named a new dean just as she was earning tenure. So she went to work for the president doing a variety of things. And she was recommended to us when we were searching for a provost here. She was young. She was early 40s. We interviewed her and were just captivated by her presence. She just was wise beyond her years and just tremendously energetic. So she came to Wake Forest as provost and was here for 4 years, but was just dynamic. We were great partners. We were very different. And one of the things I say in my chapter is Wake Forest, I was working on certain kinds of things. For instance, the Andy Chan thing in career services. We had 2 business schools, undergraduate and graduate. We were putting those together. We had huge problems in our medical school. I was working on that. And she came in, she was very interested in making Wake Forest more diverse, very interested in improving financial aid. We were actually the first top 30 university to go test optional. And that was something she and our head of admissions drove. And she I didn't know enough about that to make that decision, but she did. And together, so we made that decision.
Right.
And so she worked in her lane, and I gave her a lot of freedom to do that. And I worked on other things. And together, the university was a lot stronger.
Right. Right.
And she was actually early on here. She started being recruited to be a president. So after 4 years, she went to Colorado College as a president.
Yes.
And she was there, I think, almost a decade, and then was recruited to head National Geographic. Right. She's a person of tremendous energy, vision. There's never a challenge. I mean, there's never a problem she doesn't see as a challenge.
Right. Just another amazing person. So let's go to another amazing person, Michael Lamb.
Yeah.
Tell us about him.
Yeah. Michael grew up on a farm in Tennessee. Actually, he raised tobacco as a teenager, was part of what is it? What's the farm organization?
National
for young people.
Oh, for young people.
In any case, grew up on a typical farm. And he went to Rhodes College on a scholarship. He was very smart. And it was a service scholarship. So he got deeply involved in working with poor in Memphis, and that was very transformative. He studied philosophy, he studied history, politics. And when he finished Rhodes, he won a Rhodes Scholarship to go to Oxford. And he did theology and philosophy. And then eventually went to Princeton and earned a doctorate in political philosophy, worked on Augustine, has a big book on Augustine and hope. But Michael, in some ways, would not have, he could have easily just gone in a traditional academic track. But his whole view was, how do we help young people actually live a better life? He's deeply interested in character.
Yes.
And he went back to Oxford. Well, I first met him is something called the Oxford Character Project, working with graduate students on sort of not just how do you learn about the good, how do you become a better person?
Yes.
And actually, the way I met him, we had a Wake Forest grad who was a Rhodes Scholar, and he called me one day and said, Nathan, you have to meet this guy, Michael Lamb. I think he would have he'd be great at Wake. And so that led to a conversation. And so once again, we brought him in. We did not have a premier scholarship program.
Mm-hmm.
So we had been left a major bequest. And so we had some money to do that with.
Mm-hmm.
So we said, let's start, a scholarship program, but based on sort of character education. And Michael came in and started that, 7 years ago. And it's just he now has an organization of about 40 people. And he's been heavily supported by foundations. and most recently, a major gift from the Lilly Endowment to put forward a network of other institutions, colleges and universities who are working on these issues, and to re-grant and stimulate interest in work in that. So he's just a terrific teacher, terrific young leader. Once again, it would never happen without the right leader.
Right. No, absolutely. I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. You know, one of the things that I found myself feeling as I was reading through this book was that I felt almost a mix of intoxication or of giddiness over the hyper adrenalized capacities of each of these people who have gifts, education, intelligence, an ability and confidence, a fundamental personal health that made them a trustworthy person. They had exceptional experiences, which then set them up to be able to leverage those experiences and that knowledge or that education or those earlier roles into the roles that you were inviting them into. And you say at the beginning of the book, when you're sort of describing some of the things that are the earmarks of the kinds of people that you were trying to, the kind of person you were trying to be yourself in order to try to hire the kind of people that you then go on to describe. And one of those is identifying talent better than oneself. Another one is embracing unconventional recruiting and hiring. Another one, for example, is empowering leaders to lead in bold and creative ways. And the descriptions you've just given of the people that I called out exemplify that in their own very specific way. And that brings me to then wanting to ask more questions about you as a leader. So let me turn to that, and then we'll come back to the leaders in the book. So Nathan, one of the things that just has always stood out to me are issues of who you are as a person, your own sense of character, which is profound and rich and deep in your own being without any attempt to put you in some undeserved place. I'll just say you are a remarkable person in those personal qualities of faith, life, character. And then it's wedded to this incredible warmth that is part of how you are winsomely a leader, the distinctive leader that you are. And then you're solid and sure enough about your own identity and your own scholarly contributions and your own sense of moment as a leader that you can kind of hold all these various playing cards without anxiety, or so it seems. I'm not saying you don't have anxiety. We'll come to that in a minute, perhaps. But what I mean is there's a kind of non-anxious presence. It's more like a healthy confidence, like I was describing of these 13 people, a healthy confidence, a personal health, and a readiness to, and a flexibility of the system, which is another part of this tale I hope you can comment on, to be able to exercise great creativity and I guess one of the images that came to my mind was muscle, honestly, like leadership muscle and energy that was not about forcing something. It was about empowering someone else to actually do their work. Now, those are just among the many gifts that I feel like you have. But I'm curious, as you were in these positions, either at Notre Dame or at Wake, the roles that you had seemed to give you a great deal of freedom. Would you say, looking back, that there was that freedom, or was it that you were the kind of person who could take whatever there was or wasn't and leverage it into the freedom that could accomplish so many great hires?
I mean, I've been at two great institutions.
Yes.
And for instance, I'm coaching some presidents now who are in deep financial issues, and I never faced them. We could think of building.
Yes.
Now, I mean, in some ways, for whatever reason, I think I had a pretty good self-concept of who I was.
Yeah.
And I knew my own strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything that surprised me in universities or elsewhere, is the number of people who they do conventional hiring because they somehow having strength around them makes them nervous.
Yes. Yes.
And somehow the way I was wired, and it was from the time I was a faculty member, I said, why don't we go after the best?
Right.
And actually, as an administrator, why wouldn't I want to hire the best? Because I would look better.
Right.
I mean, for instance, I am not a numbers person. I'm a words person. But I always made sure that I had a tremendous financial person beside me.
Yes. Yes.
And that strengthened my hand.
Right. Right.
And so in some ways, I'm just puzzled by maybe someone said to me one time, you seem so self-assured. And I don't feel that way. But there was a sense in which I was motivated by strength and not by control.
Right. Right. Right.
And so I mean, hiring strong people is harder in some ways. I mean, the first person I profiled in the book named Carolyn Wu, who's a magnificent leader. She was in management education. She had been at Purdue. We brought her as dean at Notre Dame, and she was transformative. She was a wonderful person of faith. And then she went on, her final stage in her career was to head Catholic World Relief, the huge worldwide relief organization.
Yeah.
But Carolyn is a dear friend, but in the early years, Carolyn and I would have to have it out.
Right.
I would say, well, like once a month, she would hit me in the solar plexus.
Right. Right.
Because she knew what quality was.
Yes.
And she upheld that standard to me. At one time, we were talking about funding for her faculty research. She said to me, Nathan, my children don't have shoes. But seeing the way she was transforming that business school meant I could put up with the inherent tension that
Right.
created.
Right.
And then it was not. We had a wonderful relationship when we remained dear friends.
Yes. Yes.
But in a sense, hiring, or we hired Steve Reineman as Dean of Business here at Wake. He had been CEO of PepsiCo. So that takes leadership of a different form.
Yes.
Than
quite.
someone he's not doing my bidding all the time.
Yes. Right. Right.
We're partners in this work.
David Bradley, the former publisher of The Atlantic, says of himself that one of the gifts he believes he has is the ability to discern extreme talent. And as I was reading your book, David's words came to mind many, many times. And it is partly that you were discerning this extreme talent, using Julie even as an example, an extreme talent and an extreme commitment to the work that she had, and that you invited her to bring all of that to the table.
Yeah.
And because you would never hire her or the head of PepsiCo and then try to corral them. You obviously hired them to allow them to flourish. That was the whole point. And that is partly a gesture of humility on your part and a gesture of the kind of generosity of leadership that is actually part of what wooed them, I'm sure, to actually want to come to Wake, because they anticipated that that's what their experience would be like. What do you think has formed that piece of you, both the discernment piece, because you are, I think, like David, can identify extreme talent, and then on the other hand, or at the same time rather, you are quite prepared to be this gracious person who wants them to bring their A game and doesn't plan to stand in their way.
Yeah, I guess I do think I have a gene that understands talent and leadership, and I've learned as much from seeing bad leaders as good leaders.
Yes.
In some ways, people ask me, who is your mentor over time? I don't think I had one, but I learned a lot from seeing things done poorly.
Yes, yes.
And so I do think I came to understand who was a leader and who wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a curious, I mean, I try to, in my introduction, I try to say what are some of those points, but it's an interesting mixture
Yes.
of qualities that make up a leader. I think I could identify, and I guess I just knew if you have exceptional people, it takes management of a different. Management is probably the wrong word. It's collaboration.
Yes. Right. Right.
Now, there's some people I thought about in the book writing more about teamwork.
Yes.
But the book was very limited in scope.
Yes.
I could do that. But I mean, there's some people who are very strong leaders who don't want to be part of a team.
Right.
And that's not, that in my sphere, that wouldn't work very well.
Yes.
And I had one case at Wake where we parted company because in some ways that someone who just wanted to do their own thing, they didn't want cooperation. And that was not my style.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I can remember after we had a mature cabinet, I mean, I can remember we would have, on Tuesday mornings, we'd have a cabinet meeting. I can remember waking up really early to say, what am I going to say or how am I going to lead in the face of these people, some of which are much better leaders than I. I mean, I couldn't just wing it.
Right.
So by having strong people, it ups your game continually.
Yes. 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 But it is this blending of intelligences, if you want to put it that way, of which you have a number. And some of those intelligences are in the more objective category, and some of those intelligences are much more nuanced, emotional, intuitive, creative, and ultimately free. I mean, a lot of leadership is hampered by the fact that they're not free. And you seem to have been able to find and live into leadership as a free act. Even what you've just described about calling together this cabinet weekly and thinking, here we are, like this is like live theater, and it's all really going to unfold with an A team, and you may be up early trying to prepare for the A team, but you're also free to lead in the A team. You're not paralyzed by that fact.
Yeah. And that came over time. You know, I was in a lot of different positions, and your confidence, your sense of yourself. And I do think it's another theme of the book. It's why I like doing different people. I talk about leaders, not leadership.
Yes, right.
Because
right.
I think leading, like teaching, has to flow out of who you are authentically. You can't try to be like somebody else.
Yes.
I can remember my early days of teaching. I was trying to teach like my graduate mentor.
Yes.
And it didn't work. I had to come to my own voice.
Yes, find your own voice, right, exactly. Yeah.
And I think leadership, it has to be natural. It has to come out of who you are, your strengths and your weaknesses. And another thing I try to do is be honest, authentic, even vulnerable with the people around me and describe what I thought were my strengths and weaknesses.
Right. Now, in the world that you've been living in, you've had both the privilege and the opportunity to do precisely what you've done. And you've done it masterfully, both in your role as provost and also in your role at Wake. And one other piece that I just want to signal for the listeners, you referred to it a few minutes ago, but part of Wake was the hospital, which is just for its own sake. That is an enormously large, intensely complicated reality all by itself. So the thought that at a certain stage, if I have the story right, you become I'll call it the grand poobah over not only everything that was the university, and obviously that included the medical school, but now I think I'm right that it then became part of the formal structure that you were actually over both things rather than sort of, is that correct? There was some kind of
it was
earlier...
a joint, because we had a separate North Carolina Baptist hospital and our medical school. We put them together. So it was a complicated arrangement. But yeah, I was a central player.
Right.
And
And that would have
central
been
player.
more than enough. I mean, just that would have been more than enough, let alone everything else that was going on at the rest of the university. But my point is this, that you've been able to play in an A game in a staffed and funded in an A-level way. And yet so many leaders find themselves in contexts where they may be potentially one of the few A leaders around, or there aren't resources to actually do what you've been able to do. And their leadership is tested by raising up, encouraging, empowering, strengthening people who may not be, quote, A players, but
absolutely.
who become A players in the context of the terms and circumstances that particular institution or organization or company or whatever it might be is functioning. I wonder if you could just make some comments about that.
I mean, there are. I mean, this book, speaks about A players, but I do think a culture, academic or otherwise, has to give great attention to how it raises up and empowers a whole variety of leaders.
Yes.
And I think I learned that over time. And there was a case here. When I came, there was a fairly new librarian, and she didn't think the library was well supported. And so early on, we had substantial conflict. I mean, she was angry, and validly so. And actually, part of it was the work of Jill Tiefenthaler, who came in as our provost. But over time, to see that person being developed and given leadership and appropriate resources, she developed into a marvelous leader. And one year, the Wake Forest Library was voted National Library of the Year. And it wasn't because the budget was the greatest. It was the culture she built within.
Yes.
And to see that person develop as a leader was a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Because an organization takes all kind of people.
Right.
And I think that's the goal is how do you make people better and stronger?
Right.
And it's a challenge, but I think that always has to be the goal.
Right. And that's partly one of the themes of this book is the way that you have paid radical attention to people, right? I mean, even in the storytelling that you just recapped, yes, you've written about these people, so maybe these details are a bit more at the top of your head than they might otherwise be. But you've told and held their stories with memory, compassion, curiosity, respect, in all of their diversity and details, and yet seeing how these things converge. I remember one time many years ago in a church leadership role, being aware that there was a person on the staff who was deeply disgruntled with everyone, really. That was kind of the general persona, and there'd been personnel reviews that were probably going to bring this to a close and so forth. And then all of a sudden, a very outside of the job thing happened where all of us were given a window into who she was when she was fully free and flourishing. And it was recorded in video format. And it was jaw-dropping.
Yeah.
And it made all of us completely change our understanding of who this person was, because it was like, oh, that's who you are. I mean, none of us would even have imagined that she was the person that we now were able to see. And it's often been a real example, but also a metaphorical example of how difficult it can be to actually truly see the person so that you can actually understand how to support and encourage them. And while I wouldn't say that the rest of her time on staff was all glorious, there was a remarkable sense that the attitude of the whole staff was instantly changed, and that we all had a much greater sense of how we could rally around a person who had significant issues in their life that they were struggling with, but who was beautifully gifted in certain ways, and how could we foster and encourage that? Now, that was something that emerged in a kind of quirky, eccentric way. It was certainly not something that we would have had access to, but my point was, what you've done, and what I think great leadership does, is that it somehow is able to perceive the reality of who a person could be in their fullness. And you have a taste of that, but you also trust your instincts of discernment, back to the David Bradley discernment of extreme talent, right?
There's a wonderful example in the book of Julie Freislag, who became in as CEO of our medical center at a time where it was they had lost a lot of tens of millions of dollars in a bad computer new ERP system. People were discouraged. There was leadership turnover. And she came in and without essentially taking the same leadership team, she, over a period of a couple of years, just empowered the place.
Wow.
She sort of radiated positivity.
Yes.
She appreciated people.
Yes.
She said, "You're better than you know that you are."
Yes. Yes.
And it just was you just saw a cultural transformation.
Yes.
But in some ways, it has to do with, are you taking people seriously?
Yes. Right.
And things aren't just transactional. Organizations are made up of individual people who are flourishing or not flourishing.
Yes. 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 What a challenge. There are notorious challenges to higher education, and I want to just ask about a couple of those and how you negotiated them. One of the challenges that of course you're well acquainted with is the classic divide between administration and faculty. This is like, the thing that exists in most places and is one of the most obvious fissure lines that you see when you are in the academic universe. And one is not like the other, reputedly, and each has its own agenda, not always jointly connected. In reading this book, it felt to me like those were not defining issues at the level that they often are in universities. First of all, is that true? And secondly, where it was a rub, how did these leaders engage and face those particular kinds of lines of mistrust and division that often exist?
I mean, when I came to Wake Forest, there was a huge morale problem with the faculty because the university had pledged certain salary goals, which for a decade they hadn't come close to meeting. And it was a complicated set of reasons. But I realized we had to set a course to meet those, and we increased our enrollment and were able to address it. But I do think, I've been thinking about this recently. There's a lot of talk about what's the president's voice in a university.
Yes.
I found it was helpful in ongoing communication, whether that was talks, emails, to be authentic, to be personal, honest, and not trying to get away from sort of institutional speak.
Yes, right.
And I think that, I'd long been a faculty member, so that helped.
Right.
But there were ongoing tensions. I think there always are.
Yes.
But to try to know where people are and to speak to it, to speak from personal experience, to speak. If you hope to motivate people, you have to speak from the heart.
Right.
It's also more of a pastoral context. You can't just have detached, rational, academic speech.
Right. Right.
You have to speak to people who are part of a community, whether they're faculty, staff, or students.
Yes. That is one of the qualities that stands out in each of the cases, probably expressed differently through different personalities, of course, but there is a strong sense in each of the people you've featured that they are people-centric, that they understand people and they communicate to people about people-related opportunities, challenges, changes, whatever it might be. Yeah. And obviously your leadership reflects that as well. So that's a very strong culture building. Those are very strong culture building dynamics just in their own right, regardless of almost everything else.
Yeah. I actually took it out of the final draft, but when Julie Freislag came into medical center, I say she kept most people, but there was one person who actually the trustees had high confidence in, who did not treat people well. And she she fired the person within 2 weeks and said, "I don't work with jerks."
Wow. Kaboom.
It was the right decision, but I mean that showed a sort of commitment to people that sort
Yes.
of, and I think almost all the people I would say that of all the people I profile, and I think it's also distinctive of Notre Dame and the Wake culture that it's
Yes.
very people centered.
Yes. Yes. Now, it is interesting and important, and I've had longer conversations about this, to compare and contrast these two great Christian universities, one Roman Catholic, one Protestant Baptist by its foundations, both environments where faith has been in different ways and even to today expressed and manifest, of course, in different ways. And the culture of a Notre Dame, despite everything related to football and its defining presence, the presence of it being a Roman Catholic university is absolutely defining to everything about Notre Dame that I've ever experienced. And at Wake, more like a Christian foundation that probably has had highs and lows in the way that the spiritual formation of people at Wake unfolds, and does not have as thick a religious culture as Notre Dame would have. So having worked in both environments, how does your leadership in the senior roles you've had affected by those differences in the religious culture that's part of both places?
I mean, at Notre Dame, things could be more explicitly religious or Christian, although Catholic universities are different than evangelicals in that, I mean, Notre Dame had a Jewish dean of science in the 1940s.
Yes.
I mean, right. So it's a much more pluralistic, but the bottom line is it is a Catholic university, and that gives it a kind of foundation and identity that's really strong. And the continuity,
right.
I mean, Notre Dame just named a new president, but they've had 3 presidents, all priests, in over 70 years.
Amazing.
And the continuity is just tremendous.
Mm.
A place like Wake, it does have a deeply religious foundation, although since the 80s, it is a private university. I mean, it does have this, and even in its bylaws, it hopes that a religious character will be continued. And so one of the challenges was with the trustees, with colleagues, to say, okay, what does that mean?
Right.
Because I think there's a tendency in previously church-related schools to say, we're reacting to that, so anything religious we're not going to do. So I am deeply encouraged by the trustees to say, what positive things in that tradition can we renew in a pluralistic culture? So we try to have very active campus ministries.
Yes.
We expanded that. I mean, about 25% of the students are Catholic, so we supported Catholic campus ministry. We added a Jewish chaplain, a Muslim chaplain. And then you would have evangelical mainline groups.
Right.
But to say that religious life should be an integral part of, of campus life.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think issues of the whole focus on character, that's in a non-confessional way, but that really is carrying forward the deep DNA that we're called to higher purpose. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the motto of Wake is pro humanitate.
Yes.
And so that can be read in a variety of ways, but one's life is about more than self-fulfillment or financial gain.
Right. Right.
And so what does that mean?
Yes. Right. Nathan, as we finish our conversation here, I just wonder if you imagine you were speaking to a group of emerging leaders, and I'll say, just to give us some specifics to this, let's imagine it's a racially diverse group of people that are in their 30s who are in a variety of different settings of leadership, and they have varying skills. They're not all A-list, but they're all probably A-list aspirers, or they would want to do the best that they could do.
Yeah.
And they're highly motivated to bring their A game to what the task may be at hand. What would you, out of the learning that you've derived from these exceptional people that you've highlighted, what would you want to emphasize to them?
I think leadership, you have to be authentic. You have to learn to be yourself. And that is not that you can be very ambitious, but it's not a false kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you have to feel comfortable with yourself, because then when you're that way, you can also then you can reach out to others.
Yes. And
that's the other thing, connect in genuine ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I read a book recently. I forgot the name, but the thesis is that people read your real meanings, not your words.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say things that aren't really true, people know that.
Right. Right.
And I think in terms of leadership development, there is that people read whether someone's authentic or whether they're just posturing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, another thought is Jim Collins' great insight he says great leaders have, this deep sense of commitment, but secondly, they have humility. And by that, he defines they are out for the good of the organization and not just their own good.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And I think that I can say out of all the people I profile, that the bottom line is that they had the kind of character that they were out to help their college or their program or their institute. And they thought of it in holistic ways. It wasn't just, how can I do this and jump to the next job? It was a deep commitment to the common good rather than to one's own self-interest.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a wonderful statement. Michelle Gillespie, who's currently, she had been dean, she's now provost at Wake Forest, but one of her associates said, I've never seen her make a self-interested decision. That's a wonderful
thing.
commendation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Nathan, in my pantheon of leaders that have most affected me, you are among that group. And so to have you write on this subject, focus on these leaders, which is a classic Nathan Hatch move, while giving me, and I think any reader of this, a serious way of attending also to your own leadership that allows and enables and strengthens and gathers and cultivates all of this, is just, it is a joy to me and an inspiration and a tremendous encouragement. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark. You're more than gracious. I've been very blessed to work at wonderful institutions, to be a trustee of others like at Fuller.
Yes.
To have wonderful colleagues, both as historians and then in administration. I think we live in an age where people are very cynical about leaders, very cynical about institutions.
Right.
Part of that, I think bad news spreads more readily and so you read about problems on campuses. You don't read about the campuses where everything is going well.
Right. Right.
Which is actually a majority.
Right. Right.
And so it's also one of my motivations, I think, is to say, look, here is a set of people who have really, they've really led in admirable ways.
Right. Well, they're as inspiring as any little collection of leaders I've heard described in a long time. So thank you for sharing their stories.
Thank you, Mark. Wonderful to be with you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.